The fourth principle we're going to consider is perhaps the most complex. It's the affective domain. Now, as scientists and researchers and mathematicians, we're often more comfortable talking about the cognitive domain. That's how we think, the course content we're teaching, the intellectual skills we're trying to develop in students. However, just as important to student learning is something called the affective domain. This involves how our students feel, the values and beliefs and motivations that they bring to the classroom, as well as the social environment of the classroom itself. Now, as I said, this is a pretty complex issue, but it's really important that as instructors, we pay attention to the affective domain. We're going to be much more successful in helping our students learn if we do have a sense of what's going on in this domain. We can't explore all of it this week, but we'll touch on a few aspects of it, and we'll start with the idea of student motivation. Take a minute or two and think about what are some of the things that might motivate an undergraduate student to learn. We're going to give you a little prompt here to respond to. Just list as many different possible motivations that you can think of. Here are a few things that motivate undergraduates to learn. I don't know, perhaps some of what you wrote is on this list. Perhaps you identified some motivations that are not on this list. But as you look at this, there's a great variety in the kinds of things that motivate students. And that's kind of why I wanted you to think about this question. Our students bring with them a lot of different motivations. And in fact, I think another important thing to remember is that sometimes our students' motivations to learn might be very different than the motivations we had when we were in their position. So that's something to keep in mind. But certainly the kind of motivational landscape is a fairly complex one. And the other thing to take away from this is that different motivations can produce different kinds of behaviors in students. And I think that's worth paying attention to as well. The literature on motivation classifies most motivations, particularly in learning settings, in two broad categories. One is this idea of intrinsic motivations. These are the motivations that are internal to students. This is their interest in a particular subject matter. This is the kind of feeling of accomplishment that comes when you master something. These kind of internal motivations that drive us to learn and to do things. There's also the category of extrinsic motivations, the motivations that are external to us that get us to do stuff. Grades, getting into med school, the earning potential of a major, the pressure we can feel from parents. These are all extrinsic motivations. Intrinsic motivations tend to be stronger, but they're also a little harder for us as instructors to shape and to influence. Extrinsic motivations tend to be a little bit weaker, but they're a lot easier for us to trigger. When we say something like, if you're going to go to med school, you're going to need to know this for the entrance exam, then we're triggering some extrinsic motivations. Now, there's also an interesting relationship between intrinsic and extrinsic motivations. Richard Ryan and Edward Deasy have done a lot of work in this area. And they and others have done this kind of classic study where you have students coming in two groups, and they're in the kind of a lab setting, but they're solving puzzles. And one group is paid based on how many puzzles they solve. And typically what happens in these studies is that as soon as the experiment is over and the payment is over, the students stop solving puzzles in those cases. The other group is not paid. They don't get anything for solving puzzles. And typically what happens is that when the experiment is over, the students continue to solve puzzles for some time afterwards because it's fun to solve puzzles. And the takeaway from this is that sometimes the application of an extrinsic motivation, like paying students to solve puzzles, can actually inhibit existing intrinsic motivations that they might have. Those students stopped solving puzzles as soon as the money went away, although presumably the puzzles were at the outset just as interesting to those students as these other students. So one of our takeaways as instructors is that we don't need to lean too heavily on extrinsic motivations to get our students to learn, because that might actually kind of quash existing intrinsic motivations. So Ken Bain wrote a book in 2004 called What the Best College Teachers Do, and it includes a really nice review of some of this literature on motivation. And he makes the argument that students who are motivated largely by extrinsic factors tend to engage in what he calls strategic learning. So this is the idea that a student wants to get a certain grade in a course. Maybe they need an A to get into med school or what have you. Or maybe they just want to avoid a certain grade. I can't get an F, I can't get a C in this course. Either way, if they're focused on the grade as an extrinsic motivator, they tend to be a little strategic in how they go about their learning. They will learn just enough, do just enough to get the grade that they want, but they won't actually kind of pursue the subject with any depth. If you've had a student ask you, will this be on the test, then you've talked to a strategic learner. Ken Bain contrasts this with what he calls deep learning. This is really more learning for its own sake, learning for mastery, conceptual understanding, critical thinking, learning in such a way that you prepare yourself to do something with what you've learned after the course is over. He calls this deep learning. And this, of course, is the kind of learning that we'd like our students to engage in. The question is, how do we motivate them to engage in this kind of deep learning? It's hard work. It takes a lot of motivation. How can we foster some of those powerful intrinsic motivators to get students to engage in the deep learning we want them to? Now, I've talked to a lot of math faculty about this question. How do we motivate students to learn mathematics? And about half the time, I probably hear some version of this. Show them the beauty and elegance of mathematics. Now, certainly, I think mathematics is beautiful and elegant, and I try to kind of convey that to my students. But if I've got a class full of statistics students or calculus students who are taking a course because they're required to, not because they really like math, this approach will only go so far. Sure, some of the students will get kind of hooked into mathematics because of its beauty and elegance, but for a lot of students, this really isn't going to kind of sell them on it. We need more strategies for motivating our students to learn in our courses.